On this weekend, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the weekend, say a few things about that. I'm going to have a word of prayer, and then we're going to jump right in. We have a session this morning. There will be a brief break in between for some light refreshments, and we'll come back in again. I may challenge you along the way this morning, then even into tomorrow. If you have a question at any point, write it down. Some have submitted questions, and we'll answer some of those in the Q&A, but at the end of each session, Pastor Harley will give a few brief moments if you want to ask something in the moment, something he touched on, something you're wondering about, and so be mindful of that. There are handouts in the back. They're for both sessions, so make sure you grab those. There's some pins there as well. Pastor Harley Snode is the pastor of North Life Baptist Church. He planted that church in Wooster, Ohio about 14 years ago. And he said he has replanted that church 5 times. It's a work in progress, but he's doing well, and I appreciate knowing him through the years. We went to school together. He graduated a little bit after me, so he's a younger guy, but he's doing well. And about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, God led him to begin Inspire Counseling Ministry. And he heads that up and travels maybe one weekend a month doing these wellness weekends, trying to help churches just like ours. And so we're honored to have him here. We, not really by chance, the Holy Spirit was moving. We met at a meeting in the fall of last year, and we were there together and got to get a little bit more of his heart. We had seen from a distance via social media what he had to offer, and that resonated very well with my wife and I, and so we made plans for him to be here. Strategically, his wife was not able to make it due to some, they had a funeral within the church, a family, and they had to be there for that. But that also opens the door for them to come back again when she can come. So I see how that really worked out smooth. But I appreciate his heart and what he has to help us be well inside, to be well mentally, be well in our hearts, be well emotionally, and so we can engage a lost and dying world ultimately as we work through things. So I'm going to have a word of prayer, and then Harley, you come, and you just jump right into the sessions here this morning. So, Father, I pray that you would continue to meet our needs here at Victory Baptist Church. You know the needs represented not only here, some maybe after this we'll get a hold of these 4 sessions we'll have, or at least 3, 2 today and 1 tomorrow, and they'll be helped, be encouraged, be strengthened, be challenged, and I pray that we continue to be a bright light that shines within this community and help us to see the needs that people have, be able to meet them where they are, ultimately with the gospel, and ultimately through discipleship growing in the depth and their knowledge of you, and the comfort that can only come from you, the peace that passes all understanding that can only come from you. And I pray that you'd help us in these next few days and help Harley as he speaks, give him clarity, give him unction, and give us exactly what we need here. We'll thank you for it in Jesus, and we pray all these things. Amen. Harley, you come.
All right, thank you, Pastor Jason. If you will, take your Bible this morning, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 today. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Appreciate Jason and Kelly and their hospitality, and just excited to see what God's going to do this weekend in our midst. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, as you're turning there, just want to explain just briefly, I'll maybe mention something again tomorrow, but as Pastor Jason mentioned, we pastor a church in Wooster, Ohio, be like Amish country. So you have Lancaster, PA, and then you have where we are kind of the 2 biggest areas in the U.S. In fact, I think our 3 counties that are connected to our area have the largest concentration of Amish in the world. My wife's maiden name is Yoder, and so we have connections to that as well. We grew up kind of in that area, and excited to see what God's doing there. And then about a year and a half ago, we started Inspire Counseling Ministries. Really, counseling was birthed out of my own inadequacies. I remember as a youth pastor, literally this was like week 1 of being a college graduate, going into ministry thinking I know it all, or at least I probably, if I admit, I thought a little bit of that, and sitting in a meeting with an individual, feeling overwhelmed with not knowing what to do, where the Bible intersects with real life problems and challenges. And so we began getting some training, my wife and I, through Faith Biblical Counseling in Lafayette, Indiana, got some training there. I went on and got a master's degree in it from Maranatha Baptist Seminary, and we have been growing in our understanding of counseling since then. As just a pastor and as just a believer, I have needed a lot of the truths that we're going to share with you this weekend, not just once, but just this past week. We're going to talk about stress and burnout, and I was wrestling with that anew and afresh in my life, coming off vacation and some things I was facing and navigating. So excited to share with you kind of how the overflow of that. Before we talk about our topic today, to begin with, just a couple things of general note. First of all, the Bible has been inspired, right? It has been given to us through inspiration. And 2 Timothy 3 gives us that truth. And it's not just that it's been inspired by God, but it is meant to give us inspiration. It's something that we can breathe in. We can breathe in hope. We can breathe in healing. But then also, we get to share it. We get to breathe it back out to others. And so I would guess today as we sit in this session, typically what I find is often those most struggling in these areas are not in the room. Many of you probably represent adult children, sons or daughters, a spouse, a parent, a neighbor, somebody that you know, maybe even that's a part of this church body that maybe is struggling a bit. And so kind of wear both of those hats. First, make sure you're in a good place, kind of like the airlines always tell us, put the mask on first and then help your neighbor. But think of it both, first, am I where I need to be and where do I need to grow? And then secondly, with the posture of a servant. I have found that God's grace is best absorbed and processed by those who are channels, not cul-de-sacs of His grace. So if you can view it as God, do it in me, but then use this to be a blessing and help to others, I think that helps us all to come to this conversation this weekend with the right demeanor. So I hope that's a help to you. So our Wellness Weekend is just going to be looking at both things that need to be addressed or resolved that are unhealthy in our lives or in others. And then secondly, a lot of it is also preventative in nature. So it's reminding ourselves of these truths, integrating these truths into our lives, helps us to head off unhealthy tendencies that will not age well. And so I hope you'll think of it through that lens. So just kind of an overview of our weekend in coordination with your pastor. So in our first session today, we're going to be looking at stress, specifically incremental stress. In our second session today, we're going to talk about burnout. We will probably at least delve a bit into depression, not at length today as it relates to that, but depression and burnout have some connections. And then tomorrow, after our Q&A session, we are going to talk about anxiety in the main service and how the gospel gives to us clarity, hope, direction as it relates to that. And as he mentioned, please just make a note on your handout. If you have a question, I'll try to save 5 to 10 minutes at the end of both of our sessions today. It can be on any subject, but specifically in the things that we're covering. Would love to talk about that as we have time. All right, so we're going to look at today, first of all, processing incremental stress God's way. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I was reading a study the other day, this has been several months ago. There's an organization in the U.S. called the American Institute of Stress that said that 77% of Americans regularly experience physical symptoms caused by stress. Much of the physical maladies, the things even physically that we have that we struggle with, a lot of that is connected to an improper processing of stress. The study went on to say that 48% of those same people lie awake at night and have difficulty sleeping because of stress. So think about you, I don't know how far your drive was in today. I don't know if you hiked in today, rode a horse, however you came here, okay? But if you especially drove on a public road, think about this. Half of the people that you were going either with them in flow of traffic or they were going the other way were sleep deprived. Doesn't that kind of scare you to think about that at length? So half of people are regularly sleep deprived, and that is directly connected to not processing stress in a healthy way. And so this is a large issue. This is a glaring issue in our day. So look here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and we're going to look at a few other verses we'll not begin with today, but look at verse 28. So Paul's talking about all these things he's navigated as a minister of the gospel, and he talks about, really bad things, being beaten, shipwrecked, robbers, all of this stuff in the wilderness. And then in verse 28, he says this, besides those things that are without, and I think he's talking about without the body. Notice what he says in verse 28, that which cometh upon me, here's the key word, daily, the care of all the churches. Then if you will go to chapter 12, we'll come back to that verse in just a moment, what he means by that. Look at verse 9. So he's talking about his thorn in the flesh that we're going to talk about more in just a moment. And God says unto him, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Notice now verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions. Notice this next two words, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then am I strong. So we're going to talk about today specifically incremental stresses. Now there are two types of stress categorically. The first one will be what is called acute stress. So this would be a crisis happens and we go into shock. We experience certain levels of traumatic emotions, thoughts. We're going to talk about today the other type of stress, which is what is called complex stress. So acute would be more in a moment, there's this big thing that we have to try to process and recover from. Complex stress is more of what you would call like a chronic situation. So it would be exposed to maybe even something that's a minor stress, but it's over a lengthy period of time, over and over and over again. That is actually what feeds most of the stress that we navigate on a regular basis. And the idea would be there's no escaping it. There may be in this room today chronic conditions represented. There's been something you've been diagnosed with or someone you care for that you're going to deal with the rest of your life. In and of itself, it may not be a big deal for one day, but it's a big deal because every day of my life now is going to include this stressor. That's kind of the feel of what we're going to talk about in the time that we have in this first session. So the question is, in a world filled with maybe minor by themselves, but together stressful kind of situations, how do we process them with intentional soul care? I want to talk about today two biblical perspectives that we need to work to maintain and grow and strengthen if we're going to navigate incremental stress God's way. Number one, let's talk for a minute about having the right perspective in our weaknesses. Perspective in our weaknesses. As your pastor mentioned, I'm much younger than him. I'm not going to touch his wife and say anything about if I'm younger than her or not, but I'm younger than him. A couple of years we went to college together, and I just saw that our alma mater, they celebrated when I was a student their 25th anniversary. And this year they're celebrating their 50th, okay? So it's just processing that age and old and young is subjective, obviously. Somebody was talking about our eyesight. Like I wear glasses. Some of you cheat and wear contacts. You're in denial or whatever the case may be. But my prescription keeps getting stronger as I go and constantly updating that. Somebody was joking. They said, don't stress about your eyesight failing you as you get older. And here was their positive view of this. It is nature's way of protecting you from the shock of how you look when you walk by mirrors, okay? I still look great, okay? You know, that's. Have you noticed that when we're weak, that our perspective, specifically weakened by stress, that our perspective of things often gets a bit skewed? And specifically it gets skewed by our emotions. I know that when I'm grappling with stress, I tend to feel my way through that, and as I feel my way, my view of it is often distorted. The best illustration I've heard on this would be boiling water, all right? So you put some water in a pan, you turn on the heat underneath of it, it begins to boil, and somebody said this, you cannot see an accurate reflection of yourself in boiling water. That's kind of the idea, is as stress ramps up, I can't see myself accurately, I can't see God accurately, I can't see the circumstances in a way that pleases the Lord. All right, so let's talk about how God's Word and God's grace helps us to have the right perspective when we are weakened by stressful situations or circumstances. Number one, biblically process weakness that leaves you feeling overwhelmed. So the first thing that happens when we are stressed is that we feel weak, and specifically we feel overwhelmed. And Paul talks about two of these areas. Look back at verse 28 of chapter 11. He says, the things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Obviously, we're in a church setting, so let's talk first of all, number one, that often we are overwhelmed with stress in ministry. So Paul had to deal with stress as he served. First of all, there on your handout underneath, processing weakness that leaves us overwhelmed. Sometimes we're overwhelmed in ministry. And so Paul here talks about this struggle he had and how he had to process this stress in a way that pleased the Lord. It's almost as if Paul is building in intensity. He talks about this happened to me, then this happened to me. And isn't it interesting that the thing that I think was the most frequent and intense source of stress to Paul, it was not being stoned. Think about this. It wasn't being shipwrecked. It was just the day-to-day grind of caring for the churches that God had put under his oversight. This incremental stress was a major burden to the soul, to the heart, to the life of the Apostle Paul. I think he's building to the climax. He ends with what I think was the most intense thing he dealt with, which was the daily care of all of the churches. In verse 29, he explains why. He says, "Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is offended and I burn not?" He's saying, when someone in the church struggled, I felt that. When they were dealing with a burden, I felt that burden. And many of you probably serve and lead in this church and have other ministry responsibilities. And it's key that we process the stress of ministry God's way by looking to him for his grace and strength. One of the people have asked me, why are you gone? So I pastor a church, and I'm gone at least once a month doing these kind of things. Our staff will be preaching this weekend. One of the burdens I have is not just the churches, but the pastors. And I know you care for your pastor and his wife and others that serve here. And I regularly say this to churches. If you have the same pastor this morning, that you had in March of 2020, I don't care what else your church has navigated, that's a win right there. Because the great resignation, as we would call it with workplace setting, is not exclusive to non-ministry. It's happening in churches. The turnover is unbelievable. And now several years removed from that. And so encourage you to consider the stress that maybe either your pastor and wife experience or that maybe you cause them, okay, at times. At least be considerate of that and encourage them and give them some grace and room to grow in what God's doing in their life. So Paul talks about this stress he dealt with. Now look at verse 31. He says, verse 30, "If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities." The key word in this text, in this section, is the word glory. Paul's reminding them the ministry was not about him. It was about God and glorifying him and serving him. And so it's worth it to deal with the stresses that go with ministry. All right, so overwhelmed in ministry. Number two, and all of this is building toward chapter 12. Number two, sometimes we're overwhelmed in resistance. So it's just doing the service and ministry of the church. That can be a source of stress. Number two, while we're doing it, we face resistance, right? It's not like every time we do ministry, we have people just standing and applauding for us, right? Often they're fighting it. They're resisting it. Even when we're trying to help them, they're resisting what maybe we're trying to do for them. So Paul, we will not read it for sake of time, but he talks about, remember the story where he's in the city and they surround the city. They're going to take Paul now that he's converted and a follower of Christ, and they have to let him down by a basket outside of the wall, and he kind of leaves under the cloak of darkness. Not the most glorious way to make an exit. And so he refers to this season of resistance, and still it bothers him. It's something that he's still processing in this moment. We have a lot of things that we say in the church setting that are not in the Bible. And it's a pet peeve of mine. We just, and then we'll say something. And one of the ones that bothers me regularly is the following statement: God will never give us more than we can handle. Have you ever heard that? I admit, sometimes I've even said that or something similar to that. That is not found in the Bible, more than we can handle. God always is giving us more than we, without his help, can handle. And I will tell you, there's no area where that is more constantly something we're aware of than when we're trying to do ministry. It's an overwhelming calling. It's something that we need when we're stressed out to look to the Lord to help us. And so God calls us into something that's bigger than self. Are we willing to celebrate that and glory in that, looking to God for his strength? So biblically process weakness that makes you feel overwhelmed. All right, now let's go to chapter 12. Secondly, biblically process weakness that leaves you humbled. biblically process weakness that leaves you humbled. This last 2 weeks, so a week and a half or so, we got back this past Saturday. We were in like the Grand Canyon area, Phoenix, Arizona. We flew into and spent some time in Utah. And I don't know if you've been tracking the airline industry, but it's like chaos, okay? And I guess I kind of knew that. So we get to Cleveland. We're going to fly from Cleveland to Atlanta, from Atlanta to Phoenix, late flights. And we felt very soon our flight isn't leaving anytime soon. We're missing our flight in Phoenix. It was kind of one of those trips. So we ended up sleeping in the airport. We got to Atlanta late, had to wait a full day almost to get on our second flight. And so we had to spend the night in Atlanta's airport. And this picture is of my son sleeping in you know how they all have the armchair, like trying to keep this was one of the prime spots that didn't have those arm rests, okay? And so he found it. He just opened his suitcase up. He's just sleeping with some shirts over his face. And my wife, who took the picture, you can see her reflection in the picture there if you look real closely. But this is like at 4 a.m. in Atlanta, just trying to maintain your dignity. And I'll be honest, it ticked me off. We had reserved a hotel. I'm sure Pastor Jason can't relate to this or wouldn't feel this way. But I got a plan, and we just blew a hotel that we're not even going to use. And you're starting to play in your mind where this is going to go. And this is the beginning of the vacation, okay? I wanted to add to the tension in the airport, okay? Get somebody to, my rights and all that goes with that. It humbled me to spend a night in the airport. Listen to me, a lot of stress, the issue has nothing to do with the circumstances, it has everything to do with our ego. Because that difficult person or that less than ideal situation, it's bothering me. It's an injustice to me. I don't deserve that. I shouldn't have to put up with this person. And so a lot of our stress is really a pride issue. And here's what happens in that moment. When our pride is rubbed up against, two things happen. Either we allow God to humble us with the stressors, or we become embittered. And a lot of bitterness is rooted in pride that is unwilling to yield to the stress or the challenges in life. So Paul talks about two of them at the beginning of this chapter. And again, for sake of time, I'm just giving you kind of an overview of all that leads to the key verses. But in verses 3 to 6, he talks about that God humbled him in his gifting. So in verses 3 to 6, first of all, they're underneath of biblically processed weakness that leaves you humbled. God often will humble us in our gifting. So Paul talks about, and this is kind of a weird part of the study, but God caused him to see a vision of heaven itself. When he says, I knew a man, he's talking about himself. 14 years earlier, he had been caught up into the third heaven. He saw heaven with all of its glory, and yet God wouldn't let him speak about it at all. Can you imagine that? Like I would write a book, start a book tour, sign books, about the guy who went to the third heaven. And God shut all of that down. He wouldn't let him speak a word about what he had seen. We see that referenced in verses 3 through verse 6. Number 2, and this is now the heart of our study today. All of that's been to set the table now. Look at verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure, this guy who had went to the third heaven, notice now this incremental stressor that God adds to his life or allows. Through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Number 2, jot this down, humbled in limitations. God humbles us with stress, first in the giftings that sometimes he allows in our lives. Number 2, he humbles us in limitations. Your pastor last night texted me about landing here, staying here. It was quiet. It's so cool after, especially being in Phoenix last week. Felt so good last night going to bed. And he made sure I knew where the coffee was, okay, which I appreciated that. I don't know if you need coffee to get going, but I would be very grouchy today, okay, without coffee. Coffee is just a key part of my morning. A friend of mine was trying to quit coffee. Have you ever tried it? And then your spouse is like, no, you need coffee, okay? But he said this. He said, removing caffeine from your diet, he had found, eliminates 70% of your will to even live, okay? So what's the point, okay? I need this. I cannot live, I cannot function without it. I am limited without it. What is the thorn in the flesh? Have you ever studied this out? We all have our theories on it possibly of what is this thing that constantly was a source of frustration and stress for Paul. I'll give you my thought on it and the study that I've done. I likely think that it was some sort of eye ailment, some sort of limitation that he had optically. And I give you just a few kind of quickly thoughts on maybe why that's the case. Remember in Acts chapter 9 when he is converted on the road to Damascus, what happens to his eyes? He's blinded, right? Ananias comes, Brother Paul, receive your sight, but we have no indication that he received either back his full eyesight or that he had perfect 20/20 vision even prior to that conversion. So obviously his eyes were affected by that. And then in Galatians 4:15 as well as chapter 6, he talks about, you see with what large letters I've written this with my own hand. So there seems to be some allusion to, at least, that possibly Paul's eye capacity or eyesight was not everything that he would have preferred. Now, I want you to think about this today. Who wrote the lion's share of the New Testament? This same man, Paul. Can you think about how frustrating it must have been for him to not be able to read, possibly, the very things that the Holy Spirit had just penned through his life and lips to someone who was writing it down? Imagine Paul speaking in a setting like this and not being able to read the word himself. Just the irritant that was, the daily frustration that must have been to him. Also, he was often in a prison cell. That could not have helped his eyesight as well. But all of this was just an ongoing battle and struggle for Paul. Now, our struggle and stress, source of it may be different than Paul's. But that gives you at least an idea. It doesn't have to be some big diagnosis or some huge, big, hairy kind of struggle. It can just be one little thing like what Paul was dealing with that just bothers us and bothers us and bothers us. Now, notice what Paul describes it as. He says, not only is it a thorn in my flesh, but it is the messenger of Satan to buffet me. I don't know all of what that means, but at least Satan's purpose in kind of letting it be a part of Paul's life and sending it Paul's way was to try to buffet him or to discourage him, to stress him out. Notice, though, what he says at the end of verse number 7, lest I should be exalted above measure. God used it to keep Paul humble. Whatever Satan's purpose for the stressor was, God's intention was to use it to keep Paul humble. One author I was reading said this, in reference to this text, being tormented by a messenger of Satan is better than being ruined by pride. And I will tell you today, there are worse things than you living a stressless life, a life free of stress, and that is an arrogant you and an arrogant me. And the day-to-day grind of living in a fallen, broken world often is one of God's greatest gifts in our lives because it checks our pride. It keeps us dependent upon Him. It keeps us in sync with what He's trying to do in our lives. Now, I want to give you a key statement. Would you jot this down today? It's not there on your handout, but we encourage you to jot this down. This is a key thought. If you get nothing else today, I think this will help you. Much of the stress in our lives... Jot this down. Much of the stress in our lives is not the result of the thorn itself. Much of the stress in our lives is not the result of the thorn itself, but our unwillingness to humbly submit to its spiritual purpose. Key statement today. Much of the stress in our lives is not the result of the thorn itself, whatever that stress is, but our unwillingness to humbly submit to its spiritual purpose. So the stress is not because of the thorn itself, but because of our unwillingness to humbly submit to its spiritual purpose. Does that make sense? So I think where we get off with stress, we're focused on like, I wish I could eliminate this stress, instead of, God, why are you allowing this? What are you trying to do in my life? And what helped Paul here, we see clearly in chapter 12, yield to it. He kept asking God to be free of it. We see that over and over. But he finally recognized there is a benefit to this. There is a purpose for this. And the thing I found, I do a lot of counseling. I didn't mention that earlier, but I counsel a lot of folks in our community and then a lot of folks in ministry. I have 5 appointments this next week when I get home with ministry leaders. And the thing that I have found with pain is when it has no purpose is when I can't keep going. But if I know there's a purpose for it, there's a plan behind it, there's a divine reason for it, it's no easier in the moment, but I can see it through, especially these incremental things that I deal with each and every day. And so the analogy with this resisting it would be this. You ever rubbed a cat the wrong way? You know, not from head to tail, but tail to head. And they just kind of, they might even bite you if you're not careful. My wife does not like cats, okay? I love to watch a cat, maybe if we're visiting someone at their house and she's trying to be nice, wind its body around her leg, and she's like inside just wanting to scream. I sadistically enjoy watching her process that. But, you know, if you ever take a cat and you go from tail to head, you're rubbing it the wrong way. You know, a lot of our issues with stress, listen, the actual abrasiveness of it is not the thing. It rubs our pride the wrong way. What if we could just humbly submit to, like we see Paul do? He's still praying. He's still asking God for grace and, if he can, to be free of it. But he's yielding to its spiritual purpose. That reduces the friction in our lives. That reduces the tension in our lives when we yield to what God is trying to do. So stress, a lot of stress is what God allows colliding with our resistance to its purpose, if I can summarize it that way. And could it be that your stress levels could go down substantially with nothing changing in your life except your view of it, your attitude toward it? That to me gives us great hope as God's people and to those that we minister to try to help them view it the same way. All right, so number 1, our perspective in weakness. Stress makes us feel weak. Number 2, perspective in doubts. Let's spend a few moments here, and we'll give you a chance to ask a few questions or maybe even share some things that are helping you in stressful navigation as well. Perspective in doubts. I don't know if you text at all. I do, and texting can get interesting, right? Because you don't proofread it completely, or you didn't check who you sent it to. I have a few guys in our church that I thought I was sending something to my wife, and it went to them instead. And because of the babe in the text, which is my nickname for my wife, it was a little awkward when I saw them at church the next Sunday. Okay. Have you ever done that? Like either you misspell something or you send it to the wrong person, then you're like paralyzed. You can't send the next text because you just keep like dissecting it, right? So your ability to proofread text goes up exponentially right after you send it, right? Then you see, oh, that wasn't said right or wasn't the right person. What stress does is not only does it make us feel weak, it also erodes our confidence. And so we have to identify where stress is hindering us from having confidence in God, confidence in His provision, to launch out, to step out, to keep doing what He has called us to do. And this is the more subtle struggle with stress. I don't know if we realize, if we see the connection between where I'm hesitant or I'm not leaning into things God's called me to do and be, and the fact that there's a direct connection to how I'm managing or mismanaging the stressors in my life. So let's see how Paul processes this in the text. Go to verse 8. All right, so he says in verse 8, "For this thing I besought," or he prayed to God thrice, 3 times, "that it might depart from me." All right, so he asked God. Verse 9, "And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Number 1, biblically processed doubt. All right, this would be stress-induced doubt. Biblically processed stress that leaves you needy. You need something. Specifically, you need something from God. And I think there are 2 things that we need when we are stressed that God alone can provide. Number 1, we have a need for sufficiency. We need something that is all sufficient. And what God helps us with when we process stress properly is He provides for us everything that we need. Rather than removing the problem, God gives to Paul His grace. Isn't that interesting? God doesn't change anything. All He does in answer to the prayers, He gives to Paul the sufficient grace that he needs to deal with it. I think where a lot of our doubts come in is we ask God to change something, remove something, add something, and He instead gives us His grace, and we feel like that's a second-rate answer. Do you know that the stress in our life often is what causes us to both ask for God's grace, to need God's grace, and then to experience it at levels that we never would without stressors? Even the pull of gravity in our world. I don't know if you've ever read about astronauts. We may get to this weekend later, but there's an interesting study about astronauts who deal with no gravity, and it is very hard on the body to not have any tension. They have to come back, and many of them re-navigate how even their digestive system, everything about their physical anatomy is affected by zero gravity. You know, a lot of the stress and tension in our life is what keeps us locked in on God and leaning on God and depending upon God. And so this neediness for sufficiency is created by stress, and then it is answered by God's grace and provision. It doesn't clear the deck of anything, doesn't remove anything in Paul's situation, probably ours as well, but he gives to us the sufficient grace we need to shoulder it. And so better than the removal of the trial or the suffering that Paul experienced, he valued the grace that came to him. Chronic would be a word that we use in our day. They have a chronic condition. The word chronic from a medical standpoint or a counseling standpoint would be a term given to anything that lasts for 3 months or longer. So it could be any chronic condition from eczema to a life-altering diagnosis, something that is going to continue for the long haul. 3 months or longer will typically be labeled as chronic. I don't know if you have any of this in your community, but we have a lot in our church, I think maybe disproportionately so, of what are called long haulers, or they have long COVID. And we have in our church, specifically I'm thinking of 4 dear folks in our church. We're not a huge church, but we have several, and they meet monthly to encourage each other. We have a man who lost his job. He was a police officer. He can't even go up a flight of steps now. He has irreparable damage to his lungs and respiratory system, and he's on disability, trying to figure out how to provide for his family. That would be a chronic condition. What do we do with these chronic things in our lives, these sources of stress that just go on and on and on? We need to learn to look to God who is sufficient and thank God for the thing that caused us to look to Him for sufficiency. That's what Paul does clearly here in the text. All right, number 2, notice the end of verse 9. A couple more thoughts today. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather, here's the word, glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Number 2, we are needy not just for sufficiency, we are needy for glory. When we are doubting, when we are weak, we need God's glory. We need Him to be glorified in our lives. I don't know if we got any muscle car guys in the room. My dad grew up with Dodge Chargers. Those were his go-tos, late 60 models. That he regrets selling in the moment. Wish he still had those. Have been a good investment. But have you ever seen, maybe at a stoplight or something, a couple guys with their either motorcycles? My name's Harley, so I see this now and then too. Where you watch them rev their engines. You ever seen 2 guys in like Chevettes or I don't know Yugos? You remember the Yugos? Dad would always say, I know why they call those Yugos. That's because you go and I stay. They're so small. Okay. He always joke. But you don't see people revving the engine of a weak motor or engine. They revel in power, right? We don't glory in weakness. But we do when our mindset is what Paul is modeling for us here. We need God's glory. And so he glories in the infirmity. Why? Because of that, the power of Christ rests upon him. Could the answer for the power of God in our lives not be us have greater strength but less strength intrinsically? Like we want the power of, don't you want the power of God to be manifested in this church and in your family and in your own life? I do. But I often feel like me becoming weaker and having less resources is moving in the opposite direction of that prayer being answered. Listen to me, when often it's the means to it. When I am at my weakest is often when I give God the most room upon the landscape of my heart and my home and my ministry. And so this neediness is what clears the deck of our self-glory and power and gives room for God to show up and show off. And so Paul here glories in his infirmities. Verse 10, quickly, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities. He can do all this because of what he just said, in reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses, for Christ's sake. There's that key phrase, for when I am weak, then am I strong. And so these incremental distresses clear the space for God's power and glory to be seen in our lives. Most people in the world, like if you would talk to an unbeliever, and if you don't know Christ as Savior today, this may be your tendency as well. The things we're talking about that cause us stress in this incremental fashion, we tend to view those as things to endure, right? Just going to suck it up, or I'm just going to shoulder it daily, often with not the right attitude or spirit. Paul says we actually can enjoy them. James says, count it all joy. It's not the thing, but it's what the thing is producing that causes us to have joy. Even in the midst of suffering, God, you're doing something, and I see that, and I sense that, and I rejoice in that. And so we don't just endure these kind of stresses. We actually can enjoy what they are producing. One of the greatest reductions of stress in your life, and I'm working at this too, is when we finally resolve to worship God in the very place that we feel most weak. Like worshiping Him there. Whether that's a physical weakness, a relational weakness, a spiritual weakness, whatever the thing is, when we choose to worship God in that very place of perpetual need, that's when God's grace fully becomes everything that He intends for it to be. I was reading several months ago about a lady named Emma. She was, years ago, a wife of a Polish nobleman, and her biographer was writing of all the frustrations and disappointments. She had all kinds of chronic things she dealt with in her life, a short life. At the end of her biography, the biographer said this of her. He said this, she made magnificent bouquets out of the refusals of God. She celebrated what God said no to. And just like Paul, she rejoiced in the weakness, she rejoiced in the stress, because out of that, God got great glory. All right, lastly, number 2, biblically processed doubt that leaves you questioned. So one of the challenges with having stress that just goes on is people start giving their view of it. Remember Job's friends? Well, you're a big sinner. You're a big lousy loser. That's why you just lost your kids and your camels and your health. And often if we're not careful when we deal with stress, well-meaning even friends, quote unquote, in our lives, they offer reasons why this thing just keeps going on in our family, in our body, whatever the specific thing may be. And so we need God's help to process that as well. So let's look at just 2 things Paul alludes to here. Verse 11, he says, I am become a fool in glorying, ye have compelled me, for I ought to have been commended of you. Explain what he means here in just a minute. For in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. So number 1, we see that Paul is questioning his authority. How can you be a church leader and have this thorn in the flesh? Does that sound familiar? How can you have all these unresolved things in your life and you're saying God wants to use you to lead in your family, to lead in the church, to lead in the community? And so he is questioning his authority. And Paul here simply allows God to be the one who affirms him. Who's he writing to? The church at Corinth, probably the most troublesome church that he dealt with. When he writes the care of all the churches, he's maybe just being diplomatic. He's really saying, you Corinthians are the source of all my stress. I don't know. But he's writing to a difficult church, and they're not even willing to recognize and affirm his authority. And then lastly, look at verse 15. He says, and I will very gladly spend, this same church in Corinth, and be spent for you. Though the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved. Number 2, he's questioning his love. And notice how Paul responds to that. He just says to them, I'm just going to keep loving you. I would just say to you, if you deal with not just stress, but then people who try to pile on, the answer to that, if you want to ratchet up the stress, give them hate back, give them question back. But if you want to lower stress, if you want to manage stress better, more strategically, love them. Love those who question you. Love those who doubt you. And as we do so, it helps us to navigate stress in a way that pleases the Lord. All right, I want to show you a book. That next slide there, this would be a book I would highly recommend. It's called The Stressless Life. So each of our sessions, I'll try to give you a book because, we're going to talk about this for a bit this weekend. And if we're not careful, we get to Monday and we're right back to stressed out. So this is something you can read on your own time by Vance Pittman. The premise of the book is not that you have no stress, okay? So it's not stressless like, woohoo, it's all gone. It's that you're stressing less. You're reducing your stress by how you think about it, how you process it. Some very good thoughts in that practically that have been a help to me, so I hope that they will also be a help to you. All right, one last illustration, then we'll open up for a couple of questions. We're shooting to be done here by 10:30. We were in London a year and a half ago. This is a picture of a chair in what is called the War Rooms. It's underground in London proper. So this would be the bunker from which Winston Churchill basically managed World War II from England's perspective. And what's really weird about these rooms is literally at the end of World War II, literally within just a few days, they just walked out and left everything as is. So when you walk down there, they've cleaned it and kind of put up some labels and things. But it literally looks just like it would have in the late, mid-1940s. And this is the chair that Winston Churchill would have sat in. I don't know if you can see it in the picture or not, but look kind of at the arms. And they were talking about how one arm he had a ring that he would kind of wear grooves in the arm of the chair, and then the other one just his nails. Can you imagine the pressure and stress on his body and mind and heart? Literally, the survival of human civilization must have felt like it was in the balance. And here he is just kind of slowly wearing down the arms of that chair. And here's what I want you to think about today. God has given us, even though we have that pressure ourselves, He's given us something to sit in, something to rest in. And that is His grace. That is His provision. And one of the things that concerns me is I see in us the same profile as the world. We're just as stressed out as the world. When we have access to things the world does not have access to, we have something to stand in and sit in and rest in that should help us navigate it a bit differently. I give you this final thought because I think if we're not careful, our wellness can be selfish. I just want to feel less stressed. I just want to feel better. I want to feel healthier. And I think it's bigger than that. An author I was reading said this: God does not want a bunch of stressed out, worn out, done in, washed up children representing Him in this world. He wants us to be fresher day by day, hour by hour. So our wellness in this area, specifically of stress, is also evangelistic in nature. So like if we're declaring the grace and goodness and glory of God and we are stressed out of our minds, that's probably not going to be the most compelling profile of the gospel, right? So this is not just internally so we can all feel better and feel good and feel less stressed. Your stress levels and how you manage it largely defines the effectiveness or lack thereof of your gospel testimony, starting with your own spouse and your kids and your neighbors. So this wellness thing, specifically of stress, is really about the salvation possibly of those that know you and watch you navigate these different things in your life. So it's a big deal for your own blessing and benefit, but also for those that we testify of. And Paul went on, despite this thorn, to do much more ministry, and we still benefit from that today. Not because God eliminated the stress, but because he learned how to navigate it God's way. So I hope those thoughts today will help you, and you'll consider maybe some areas that you can grow in. All right, let's open up for a couple of questions, maybe something, and I love to